A lot of times, an entrepreneur's journey goes something like this. You're working a job, you want to start a business, maybe you side hustle for a bit, then quit that job. And then you work on that one business exclusively, maybe until you retire or die. But that definitely wasn't the case for Scott Blackwell, owner and distiller of High Wire Distilling Co in Charleston, South Carolina. Today's part one of our conversation. It's his road to distilling via a number of other business ventures. This is Chris Spear, and you're listening to Chefs Without Restaurants, the show where I speak with culinary entrepreneurs and people working in the food and beverage industry outside of a traditional restaurant setting. I have 31 years of working in kitchens, but not restaurants, and currently run a personal chef business throwing dinner parties in the Washington, D.C. area. And before I get too far here, I want to say that this is a conversation with Scott, but it's also a business very much run with his wife, Anne. I think I actually met her first, to be honest. And as I alluded to earlier, Scott's journey didn't take him right to distilling. And this conversation isn't actually about distilling at all. Scott's been a Ben & Jerry's distributor, owned a coffee roaster and bakery, and started a line of frozen doughs. I found his story to be so interesting and thought that food and beverage entrepreneurs would really enjoy it. But I also realized that some people just want to hear about the distillery business and making whiskey, so I cut this episode into two parts. This part will take you right up to the point of when he starts that leg of his entrepreneurial journey. Part 2, the distilling story, will be released next week. And a bit of podcast housekeeping here. I recently posted online that I'm looking for guests to be on this show. I was overwhelmed to have more than 200 inquiries in a matter of days. If one of them was you and you haven't heard back, I want to let you know that I'm working through them, and I hope to be in touch very soon. And if you're listening and think that you have a good story to tell, feel free to reach out on Instagram at Chefs Without Restaurants or email me at chefswithoutrestaurants@gmail.com. As always, thanks so much for listening and have a great week. Are you a personal chef looking for support and growth opportunities? Look no further than the United States Personal Chef Association. With 1,000 members across the US and Canada, USPCA provides liability insurance, certification, lead generation, and more. Consumers can trust that their meal experience is insured and supported by USPCA. Apply now for USPCA membership and save $75 on Premier, Provisional, Preparatory, and Corporate memberships, as well as $25 on student memberships by using code HAPPYNEWYEAR24 at uspca.com/join. Plus, Hire Chef subscriptions are available to list your personal chef business at hirechef.com. To learn more about membership, advertising, or partnership opportunities, call Angela at 1-800-995-2138, extension 705, or email aprather@uspca.com. Hey, Scott, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to talking to you today. For our listeners who don't know, Scott, he made the world's largest cookie. Isn't that right? That's what you're known for, right? The world's largest cookie?
Yes, that will be on my tombstone, I think. My wife Anne does not like to talk about that very much. It was, and I won't go into all the gory details, but it was a fun, cool event, but it was also very hard and had a lot of theater. There especially at that last few hours. So,
I'm sure
we still hold that record. 20 years this year we'll have held that record. So it's our big anniversary this May.
I know every year you post it up on social media. So
yeah. Well, it was a feat, and I think the people that were there, it's one of those things where it sounds silly and all that, but ultimately it was a thing like. I don't know, climbing a big mountain, maybe not Everest, but one of the other big ones around the world. And it was a huge undertaking, no pun intended. But it was the previous record was 24,000 pounds and I think 80 feet or 79 feet or something like that. And we looked at it and said, well, if we're going to do 81 feet or whatever, why don't we just do 100, And, if we get that big, what's 20 more feet? And we mismeasured. So we actually ended up with 102 foot and 40,000 pounds.
Overachiever.
So yes, it was, so I'm throwing out the challenge. Somebody, go and do something, but don't do 103 feet, do, 150 feet or something, do something real.
Yeah. Well, I thought that would be a fun way to start the show. Actually, you are the owner, distiller of High Wire Distilling Company down in Charleston, South Carolina, which you run with your wife, Anne. And I've often said it's my favorite distillery in the country. I don't know when I found you guys. I mean, I've been down to Charleston a bunch. My sister-in-law lived down there for over a decade. So that's how I got to know you. And since you're my favorite, I wanted to have you on the show and kind of talk about what you're doing down there.
That's awesome. No, I think it was pretty early on. I think you were one of the early adopters. I think it probably was in the first couple of years, to be honest.
Well, I think it was through social media. I don't know, was it you or Anne, like who was doing like the Instagram? It's probably even Twitter at the time, right? Like I feel like the early days of social media where I was just connecting with all these people and I was really interested in Charleston, like Sean Brock and all those guys. And I think I just was even following you on social media before I even came down that first time. It was probably a couple of years just talking to you guys.
Yeah, it probably would have been Anne doing most of the social media. I did a little bit. I would take a picture and think it was cool and throw it up on Instagram or on Facebook or something or post an article. But she is a much better writer and her posts are a little bit more.
And it's so much more in depth now. I mean, thinking about like even a decade ago, what we were putting out now, it's like a whole job. I mean, it is a job. Like there are people who do just social media. That's their whole thing. But I guess kind of like going back to the cookie and the baking and everything, before you had the distillery, you were doing other things in the food world prior to distilling. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Like your background in culinary and pastry and how it led into distilling?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's pertinent to kind of how we ended up in the business. Well, it's sort of pertinent into how we ended up in this business, but also pertinent to our approach to this current business. And, I worked just like a lot of young, teenage kids in a kitchen. My first job was washing dishes at a Greek restaurant, a hamburger joint. And then from there, I ended up with, jobs through some fast food chains, et cetera, Chick-fil-A, places like that. And, it was kind of where I could get a job at that point. Young guys, weren't, you either cut grass or you worked at a restaurant, it felt like. And I ended up going to school, and about midway through school, I proclaimed that, after I get out of college, I'm never going to work in the food business again, and famous last words, that's all I've ever done. So while I was in school to make extra money, I started making desserts out of my apartment. So I was a chef without a restaurant. We
call that cottage baking now, don't we?
Yeah, illegal cottage baking. So I was under the radar. It was just, to me, it was not really a business. It was like cutting grass or something like that. I just, made pies and, pretty simple stuff. But in those days, I was all about real ingredients. So, like key lime pie I made had real key limes in it. It didn't have bottled juice. It didn't have, I was actually squeezing the limes and making the crust with butter and stuff like that. And in those days, this would have been in the 80s, it was all about like kind of Cool Whip type desserts. It was about, just big and sugary and not really a lot of what I would call real flavor. It was just sweet. And I love chocolate, so I quickly got into the chocolate pie and cake business. And before I knew it, I was making a fair amount of money. And I was watching this show called Growing a Business on PBS. It was hosted by a guy named Paul Hawken, who started Smith & Hawken. And I saw these two guys from Vermont that had an ice cream company, and they were making ice cream that was very similar to how I was approaching my pies. So I thought, oh, cool, I ought to call these guys and see how they did it. Maybe I'll do this instead of getting a real job. And called up to Vermont and ended up asking for Ben or Jerry. And that woman laughed and said, who is this? And, basically I didn't get to talk to Ben or Jerry. But it led me to eventually going to Vermont they invited me up there. I met Jerry down here in South Carolina, and ended up going up to Vermont and became the 9th distributor in the country for those guys. So
I had no idea. I've never heard this story before.
yeah, so I was 21 and I had no money, it was a total fluke. And at that point, Ben and Jerry's was not a big company, but it was that distribution and that packaged product and the marketing and the socially conscious approach to business. It was Tom's of Maine and Anita Roddick from Body Shop and all those early guys. And I just really thought that was cool to have a business and make a positive impact on your community, and have fun doing it and make something that tastes good and really a simple approach. So the seeds were planted at that point. And, long story short, I ended up selling part of that business because I didn't have money and I needed cash to run the business. And I took in investors and sold about 3/4 of the business off, and really just figured out that I was just working for other people. And I was like, I want to work for myself. So I jumped out, and a friend of mine had working in a fairly large corporation, asked me if I could do breakfast for their meetings. And, it was like quick breads. So I was doing muffins and things of that nature. And then I had met the Green Mountain Coffee guys when I was up in Waterbury. So I got interested in coffee and started making these desserts. And then and she said, could you do lunches? And this was there again out of my apartment. By this point, I'm back in my apartment. And I made these desserts and sandwiches and stuff like that. And then I thought, shit, if I'm going to do this, I may as well get legal and open up a brick and mortar place. So I found this old dumpy building in downtown Columbia behind the State House next to the university that had been a Kinko's, and thought, I'll never open up the front door. I'll just do all this out the back. But then I thought, well, shoot, there's the State House is right here in the university. I may as well open up the door and see if anybody comes in. And I think I was 24 at this point, and I did all the renovations myself, sanded the floors, etc. This was in the era where you could get away with a lot of that type of stuff, and it was just a sandwich and soup and salad place. So I created, and I had to come up with a name because the fire marshal basically inspected me and said, "That's all great, you look great, but you have to have a name out front. You need, what's the name of your business?" And I was like, I was just going to open it up without one. It was a total, something you do when you're 24.
Yeah. Not many 24-year-olds start their own business like this.
So I got the dictionary out and looked through the vowels because I felt like, a name with a vowel, just start there. And I got to the I's and I saw the word immaculate and I started laughing. Had this idea of immaculate consumption. And so that's what the restaurant is still called. It's been there 33 years now. And my manager bought it. He still owns it. But I opened up and there was a line out the door. It was obviously a success. But when I owned that business, I got really I was interested in coffee, but I'd seen a show on espresso. And I said, I want to learn more about that. So I flew out to Seattle and went to a coffee show, and all these, super geeky guys and gals were latte art and all this, fanatical level of attention to detail with coffee and all about the varietals. And it opened up this whole world to me. And I just thought it was sort of cool. So long story short, I ended up buying a roaster while I was out there and delivered back to South Carolina and became the first coffee roaster in South Carolina in my basement at the restaurant. So opened up a little espresso bar, and then, my baked good stuff was, starting to get better. I was starting to add scones and biscotti and stuff like that. But after about 9 years of running that restaurant and coffee shop, I just started thinking, I really want to get back to this packaged thing again. So that's where the bakery was born, Immaculate Baking. which was the business previous to this and the most successful business. So, I made cookies and coffee wholesale. And in those days, it was like the days of Barnes and Noble and Books A Million and all these stores. They had coffee shops in them. So every little mom and pop bookstore had a little coffee bar or whatever. Or maybe you had a hair salon or whatever, record store. So I ended up selling to a lot of these guys, and they loved my cookies and stuff, but the problem was stales. So I started making dough and freezing it and delivering them to dough, and then they could just bake off in their store in a little small oven what they wanted for that day, and that way they basically cut down their stales. They had more of a great smell in the building, and they had a wow kind of experience for their customers because it was a fresh cookie or scone or whatever. And that was where a little light bulb went on. And so eventually I sold the restaurant to my manager, had the coffee in the bakery. He didn't want the coffee roasting operation, so I broke that out. And it was kind of confusing. I'd go to trade shows and people were like, coffee bakery, huh? What are you? Are you a bakery or are you a coffee roaster?
But they seem like they naturally go together. Like I see them as together. People really didn't see that.
Well, for wholesale, they couldn't, it was like, like which is better? And I'm like, they're both great. But, it was small. I was doing like $400,000 a year or something like that. It was not a big business. So I had a local guy, sold the coffee roasting operation to down in Spartanburg, and I had broken it off and kind of come up with a separate name because I had Immaculate Consumption Coffee Roasters, but then I had Little River Roasting. Little River is this trail that runs up through, up in that area, up in the foothills, and so I called it Little River Roasting. And Little River Trading was the bakery side of things. So I ended up selling that Little River brand to this guy in Spartanburg, and he still owns it. And that is where Ann and I met. Ann worked for him. And so with the bakery, I was starting to see potential with like the Fancy Food Show in New York and San Francisco. And then, of course, Whole Foods, the natural food world, all the bread and circuses up in the Northeast, which eventually became Whole Foods. And
it's been ages since I've heard of bread and circus. We used to have them because I'm from Massachusetts, and that's what we had. And I remember the transition over from when my bread and circus in Providence, Rhode Island, switched over to a Whole Foods. That was a big deal. Yeah.
No, and that's how they grew so quickly. They acquired regional brands, and that's how they went public to do that. And it was really interesting in those days to deal with those folks and to sort of have people that appreciated a product that was made with good ingredients. And it was a perfect world, to be in at that point. And I was in the business right at the right time, doing the right thing. So organic had been a thing, but it was more of associated with like healthy, tastes like cardboard kind of food. And then it was starting to become more trendy, and, Whole Foods, made it sexier. So I was able to ride in on that wave, and we went national with Whole Foods, and we became the #1 natural and organic place and bake cookie dough. So, just think Pillsbury and Nestle, and then eventually launched rolls in those tubes, the Whoppums or whatever people call them.
Where you like push down with your thumbs and it like pops open kind of thing?
Exactly. So we were the #1 in the natural food side, of course, with that. So we had biscuits. We just went down the data. We went biscuits, cinnamon rolls, crescent rolls. One thing I learned is that you didn't have to have the most incredible product. You had to just have consistency, and you had to have distribution, and you had to, be able to deliver the product at a decent price. And, so it was all around the word value. And that business around distribution, especially in data, taught me and Ann about sort of paying attention to the market. So it's like a lot of people just start a business and they go, oh, I make great stuff and my neighbors all love it. I should start a business. I should this is my case, my focus group, and why, they all tell me I should, package these things, and it's like, yeah, but you've got too much ingredient cost, or you've got, the scalability, and, there's just a lot of that. I have these conversations a lot with entrepreneurs or people that want to, especially chefs that want to break out and have
the personal chef thing, like, oh, my family says I'm a great cook and all my neighbors love it and I cook for barbecues. It's like, yeah, but do you know anything about business? Like actually like running the number, like, have you done any kind of business work? Like, do you know what it's like to just start a business cooking for people? You know? I mean, you can do it, but the amount of people who just think they're just going to go out there with no business experience and start a successful business like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I learned a ton, and we were lucky enough that bakery was in my garage when I moved it, to the mountains of North Carolina, and the coffee roasting was down the street. Sold the coffee roasting off and moved into a little bit bigger building with the bakery and automated a little bit, and then moved into a bigger building and automated even more. And then really we were scaling so quickly, I thought, I'll never co-pack. I would never let somebody else make my product. But when I realized, they could do it better than I could, and I could also be super nimble and just focus on one thing, which was growing my business, that's what we ended up doing. So we ended up outsourcing all of our production to dough manufacturers. So we set up an old Sara Lee plant outside of St. Louis, and the stuff I learned with all that, it's just mind-boggling. And we did it in 12 years, and we sold that business. We had a couple of suitors, Annie's, the homegrown macaroni and cheese folks, had gone public, and they were looking for acquisitions, and then General Mills. And, we had a few other tire kickers, but ultimately we sold the business to General Mills in December 31st of 2012. And Ann and I signed a lease down in Charleston, had already signed a lease provisional around us selling the business. And so once we sold that business, we picked up, and we were in Charleston February 1, and we started work on the current business. So I knew that took a long time. Every story doesn't take that long. So
it's great because it's like a whole nother story. It's like a lesson on business building. And I don't know anyone who, it's serial entrepreneurship. It sounds like, to have all that experience. It wasn't just like I was working a 9 to 5 and then I started distillery. It's like I started a business, and so forth. And I think that's really great because so many of our listeners are entrepreneurs, people looking to start businesses. I didn't know almost any of that story. I knew about the cookies because you hooked me up with an oven that you used to use at trade shows, which I still use. It's an amazing oven. I take it to houses. Like, one of my questionnaires for my customers is, how many ovens do you have? And if they say 1, I throw that oven in the van and I take it, and it's great. You can put it on any countertop there, and I've got an extra oven that can, do 3 quarter pans in there. So it's served me well, cool. And I still use it.
About that. Yeah. We had multiples of those with the bakery, and those little ovens are workhorses. Yeah.
They are. I tell anyone, if you're looking for one, if you can find something like that, it's so worth it. So totally appreciate that. You're still here? The podcast's over. If you are indeed still here, thanks for taking the time to listen to the show. I'd love to direct you to one place, and that's chefswithoutrestaurants.org. From there, you'll be able to join our email newsletter, get connected in our free Facebook group, and join our personal chef, catering, and food truck database so I can help get you more job leads. And you'll also find a link to our sponsor page, where you'll find products and services I love. You pay nothing additional to use these links, but I may get a small commission, which helps keep the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast and organization running. You might even get a discount for using some of these links. As always, you can reach out to me on Instagram at Chefs Without Restaurants, or send me an email at chefswithoutrestaurants@gmail.com. Thanks so much.